Good evening, this is Eric J. Thank you for joining me. Sorry it's been so long since my last video, but here we are. This will be dealing with Federalist Paper number 6. In this paper, it is now actually Alexander Hamilton that is discussing the possibility of dissension between the states. Don't forget, make sure you remember to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out whenever I upload a new video. Below is a link to the Tom Woods Liberty Classroom where you can learn more about free market economics, which is espoused by such amazing scholars as Milton Friedman and Murray Rothbard. Oh, good evening. Like I said, this paper is about Alexander Hamilton discussing the possibility of how it would be occurring with dissension between the states themselves, expanding off the previous Federalist paper. Alexander Hamilton references the greater dangers that would happen between the states, not from foreign powers, but from what he refers to as convulsions, referencing the internal factions that could cause strife within the states themselves or in between the states. Hamilton acknowledges that this topic has been addressed in previous papers, but he felt the need to go into it into greater detail through this paper. He noted that it is essentially a utopian fantasy by some people to think that if the states remained disunited, that they would not devolve into hostilities between one another. To quote him, "To presume a want of motives for such contests as an argument against their existence would be to forget that men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. To look for a continuation of harmony between a number of independent, unconnected sovereignties in the same neighborhood would be to disregard the uniform course of human events and to set at defiance the accumulated experience of the ages." Hamilton comments that the nations have always had reasons to enter into conflict with one another. Some of these reasons have had near constant effect on all societies. Some of the reasons being the love of power, the desire for preeminence and dominion, meaning to control or essentially dominate, as well as in jealousy of that same power, as well as, ironically, for the desire of equality and safety. Another reason is also rivalry for competition in commerce. Additionally, another perverse reason is the individual passions of leaders of their relative communities. These types of men, whether favorites of their own leaders or favorites of their local communities, they have also too often abused that power for their own gain. They do not show willingness to sacrifice their own power and influence for the betterment and for the benefit of the general society. Through the Federalist Paper, Hamilton draws upon several examples of Greek history, but for those of us not acquainted with Greek history, I'll only quote a few of the examples he presents. The celebrated Pericles, in compliance with the resentment of a prostitute, Apasia, at the expense of much of the blood and treasure of his countrymen, attacked, vanquished, and destroyed the city of the Sarmatians. The same man, stimulated by private pique against the Megranesians, another nation of Greece, or to avoid a prosecution with which he was threatened as an accomplice of a supposed theft of the statuary Phidias, or to get rid of the accusations prepared to be brought against him for dissipating of the funds of the state in the purchase of popularity. These, as well as other examples referenced, show how the actions of one man, with the addition of others, helped bring about the Peloponnesian War. A war among geographically close nations brought about the destruction of the Commonwealth of Athens. Hamilton also reached back into the history between Britain and France, where a war was precipitated between these two nations by a Catholic cardinal who was working as Prime Minister to Henry VIII. This cardinal aspired to wear the Triple Crown, which is a crown worn by the Pope. He aspired to this lofty position under the influence of Emperor Charles V, who himself desired universal monarchy. Going into this war against the policy of his nation, as well as even against the very judgment and advisement of his very court. This event shows on how one man, meaning Cardinal in this case named Wolsey, was utilized by an emperor to expand out his own influence, and therefore this cardinal he was trying to garner the favor of this emperor to seek out that position. So he was being used by Emperor Charles. Hamilton also notes that any man with even a superficial knowledge of human nature will fully acknowledge that individuals can and will place their own interests above what is even more beneficial for the entire nation in either domestic or national policy. And we see that in the United States now, where we have politicians who are trying to place their own financial or political favor, injecting that into domestic policy, whether it be gun control, whether it be the abortion issue, what have you, or even the international situation with Yemen, with Russian situation, or possibly any kind of an economic interplay between nations, and how that would benefit that individual politician to the detriment of the nation, which we only really find out later. As a more direct example, to reference how the desires of an individual place their actions to benefit themselves over what is more beneficial than the community, Hamilton referenced a man named Shays, as in Shays' Rebellion. And anybody who's familiar with history, that name will start to ring a few memory bells. Hamilton referred to Shays as a desperate debtor, mentioning that if Shays had not been such a debtor, he might not have plunged Massachusetts into a civil war. Hamilton also reinforces that there are those men of ideology, which he refers to as visionary or designing men, who continually advocate that, despite reason and experience, that the individual states can remain in a state of perpetual peace despite being disunited. What Hamilton describes as dismembered and alienated, really separated politically and economically from one another. Hamilton asserts that these types of men assert that republics are pacific, meaning peaceful, assuming that commerce alone is capable of softening the manners of men, making men less warlike. To quote him, he says, "Commercial republics like ours will never be disposed to waste themselves in ruinous contentions with each other. They will be governed by mutual interest and will cultivate a spirit of mutual amity and concord," which this is the perspective of these people who think that a disunited nation can still remain largely friendly with each other. Hamilton then challenges these men with the concept that should not all nations also bear out the same benevolent and philosophic interests? And if so, have they then actually pursued this? And to quote him here, "Has it not, on the contrary, invariably been found that momentary passions and immediate interest have a more active and imperious control over human conduct than general or remote considerations of policy, utility, or justice? Have republics in practice been less addicted to war than monarchies? Are not the former administered by men as well as the latter? Are there not aversions, predilections, rivalships, desires of unjust acquisitions that affect nations as well as kings? Are not popular assemblies frequently subject to the same impulses of rage, resentment, jealousy, avarice, and of other irregular and violent propensities?" But first, if you wish to know more about this topic, please ensure to look below at the description box for a link to the book of the Federalist Papers, which is provided by the Institute for Principal Studies, which is an amazing organization which provides resources relating to economics and the role of government from a biblical perspective. Hamilton continues to question those who reinforce the universal benevolence of men along the same path for quite some time. Hamilton does point out an interesting question, in that has commerce done anything to change those same targets that are sought after in war? My own opinion, and this is our conflicts that have been sought out potentially for the purpose of trying to take over oil fields and whatnot for the wealth that those bring, as well as even the drug war and the financial benefits that those bring to a local economy. And I say that with regards to how much money do the cartels earn from all of this, and the potential of does any respective government, maybe even our own, financially benefit from that in some way. I'm making no assertions, merely making questions. To quote Hamilton in this, "Have there not been as many wars founded upon commercial motives, since that has become the prevailing system of nations, as were before occasioned by the cupidity of territory or dominion?" Meaning that even in that time, how many wars were targeted upon the acquisition of things and other commercial desires, as much as they were related to expanding territory or influence. Hamilton also points out that commerce itself has provided additional incentives to take different commodities by force through war and conflict. As an example of this, reaching again back into history, Hamilton looks at several city-states from ancient Greece. As an example of this is the propensity of nations. Hamilton looks back to, he reaches back into history at nations of antiquity, such as Sparta, Athens, Rome, and Carthage, who were all republics, Athens and Carthage being more commercial, and yet all of which were nearly universally engaged in constant warfare. In pointing out the issues relative to these nations, Hamilton describes Sparta as a well-regulated camp. Hamilton also describes Rome as never sated of carnage and conquest. Hamilton also describes Carthage as the aggressor in the very war which brought about its own destruction. Hamilton explains that historically, Hannibal of Carthage invaded to the very heart of Italy, until Scipio counterattacked and drove them back to completely conquer Carthage. Hamilton even refers back to Venice, which involved itself in ambitious wars, until forced to join with the various states of Italy by the machinations of Pope Julius II. Hamilton also references Holland, which was mired in numerous wars until that was brought to a halt by its own debt and its own taxes. He also refers back to the history of Britain, who always had a strong commercial economy, yet always remained in perpetual wars and conflicts, largely and predominantly due to the desires of the people themselves. To quote him here, "There have been, if I may so express it, almost as many popular wars," popular referring to the people, population, "as royal wars. The cries of the nation and the importunities of their representatives have, upon various occasions, dragged their monarchs into war or continued them in it, contrary to their inclinations, sometimes contrary to the real interests of the state." But first, please check this out. Also, for those fans of Ron Paul, go ahead and look below in the description box for a link to his homeschool curriculum. He also notes that the rival noble houses of Austria and Bourbon maintained continual warfare in Europe, largely through the continual and exacerbated hatreds between Britain and France, along with their relative ambition, and pushed the greed or avarice of the favored leader of the people into prolonged wars, even when it was against the better interests of the nation. Now, if you think about that, how many wars has the United States been in that it shouldn't be in? How many of them are being perpetuated, and by whom? But returning back to Hamilton, he was also referencing on how these two rival houses were also pushing these conflicts against the objections of the respective courts. Hamilton also notes that most of the conflicts between these two nations have grown out of commercial interests. And to quote him, "The desire of supplanting and the fear of being supplanted, either in particular branches of traffic or in general advantages of trade and navigation." Now that quote references why these conflicts between Britain and France would be precipitated out of a commercial interest. Hamilton then questions why, despite these known histories of other nations, which at the time were similar to our own, what reason can we think that we would fare any better than them, and pursue our own course of mutual peace in between the states when they could not? Hamilton then points out that these men have seen enough of the realities that have existed, answering the theories of these men who believe that the states can coexist peacefully despite being separated. to quote Hamilton, "Is it not time to awake from the deceitful dream of a golden age, and to adopt as a practical maxim for the direction of our political conduct that we, as well as the other inhabitants of the globe, are yet remote from the happy empire of perfect wisdom and perfect virtue?" Hamilton then calls upon his readers to remember the depressed situation with the nation and its credit have endured, and the conflict and insurrections felt in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. He also called on people not to be lulled into a false sense of contentment and complacency by those who are trying to distract the population from the fears of hostilities between the states themselves, given the variations of politics and their respective vicinity, how close they are to one another, and that these situations possibly constituting natural enemies. Hamilton lastly quotes another writer in saying this: "Neighboring nations," says he, "are naturally enemies of each other unless their common weakness forces them to league in a confederate republic, and their constitution prevents the differences that neighborhood occasions, extinguishing that secret jealousy which disposes all states to aggrandize themselves at the expense of their neighbors." Thank you for joining me. Make sure you remember to like the video, subscribe, and comment.